Hi, I'm Bob Ellsworth. What have I got in store for you? Oh, all the adventures I've shared, whether they're on islands or offshore or wherever they might be. Had a lot of good times with a lot of wonderful people. Met some very notable people and very, very capable people. And that's what I want to tell you about, because there's stories that go with everybody in this world. And that was part of our adventure. And we enjoyed it whenever we went on these adventures. And they were on islands. Sable Island was one of them off the coast of Canada. Down in Florida for another adventure. And then with Maureen O'Hara, one of my favorite Hollywood actresses, in the adventures of putting together the documentary of the big plane, which can be seen up at the New England Air Museum. Join us, won't you? Thank you.
It greeted you at birth. It was there for your first step, your first mistake, your first kiss. It's with you when you win, when you lose, when you pick yourself up again. In every moment, you can feel it. Life. Human right number 3, the right to life. What are human rights? Find out at youthforhumanrights.org.
Good evening. I'm Bob Ellsworth. I want to share some things with you tonight as a beginning of a series I hope you'll enjoy here on Nutmeg TV. Land, Sea, and Air Adventure Bound. That's what I call it. Well, I've explored them all, and from each has come an amazing revelation of the wonders of the universe. And I think you have to get something out of an adventure when you go on it anyway, and if you don't write about it or photograph it, I think you're missing a great deal. In this case, what we're going to see tonight is titled 33 Fathoms Plus. It's about free breath hold diving. And I got connected to it with a friend of mine who said, gee, if you'd like to see this guy and talk to him, he was Engineman First Class Bob Croft, the United States Submarine Base in Groton, Connecticut. And I talked to him and I interviewed him for a half an hour, and he said, I can hold my breath for 5 minutes. Well, you have a certain amount of skepticism when people tell you things like this, but he said he had been tested at the laboratory by the doctors and so on down at the submarine base. And I said, okay, if that's the case, why don't we plan when you go down to Florida, and he was under another person's aegis at that time, to make this adventure or trip to break a record. And I said, what kind of a record is it that you want to break? He said, well, there was a Greek diver by the name of Stati Gorius, just a regular civilian in the Mediterranean area, who went 198 feet on one breath. What the idea of breath hold diving is that you go down the line, which is the rope, what's known as a line in the Navy, and you touch wherever you think this is the time for me to turn around and whatever depth you've achieved, and you climb back up. You're talking here at that particular point somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20 stories if you were to measure it by building height. And this is the training tower and Croft. The training tower is the diving training tower. Not only do they put all the United States Navy sailors from the submarine fleet and other sailors that are interested in diving, you know, they're part of the crews of the regular surface ships, but they put the state police and their divers who do such great rescue and accompaniment work for cases that they're on from the state of Connecticut through that tank and its training. The tank is, I'd say roughly, when I say 33 fathoms plus, that's what it amounts to. In other words, it's the equivalent of a 21-story building and maybe a little bit bigger. And that's what they go through. Well, Croft, of course, trained in here, and he would demonstrate to tourists or visitors when they were passing through the base at that time just what it's like to dive in that tank. And they tell a story one time he got caught on the bottom of the tank, and because of his unusual lung structure, because he suffered rickets as a child, it expanded his lung capacity. He could hold his breath for 5 minutes. Well, under those circumstances, he got so comfortable, and by the way, the water in the tank is quite warm. He said it's about 90 degrees and it's really nice. Too nice, he fell asleep. And they had to really bang with wrenches on the side of the tank to wake him up, because you can only stay asleep so long when you're down there. Even though you may be a relaxed phenomenon, you've got to wake up in time to punch that lung into action and surface, which they did. But the crowd was quite thrilled when he didn't respond in the beginning. And when he had gone down to show them, and he waited a while the description went of his being there in the first place, he was supposed to bend over, untie his sneakers, take them off, and bring them up with him. Meanwhile, he fell asleep. So that's why that got confused. And the crowd was thrilled, and they gave him a nice round of applause when he came up. And although he smiled and said, "Gee, that was an unusual thing to happen," he said, "I don't want it to happen again." There's only a certain amount of things you can control in this world. But that's the physical layout which started Bob on his challenge of the record we'll talk about in just a minute. The whole thing behind this was to go with this group that wanted to back his play for the depth dive, and they made me the public relations director. They said, "What do you think we ought to do with this?" I said, "I don't know." I said, "Make a film out of it." He said, "How do you do that?" I said, "Well, I've got a 16 millimeter. In those days, that was, before videotapes, extensive use. And I said, we'll do that, and I'll try to get some other people interested in it, and I'll try to alert the networks and so on, and if he does it, well, we'll get exposure, trust me." So this is what we did, and I went with the group down to Florida, and we had a great time, and then we went out to work. This consists, when you're going to make a dive like this consists of a lot of effort. He had what is known as cover divers. All of his mates and pals were with him. He had about a half a dozen folks, all Navy divers, at that particular juncture, and they were going to cover him while he was down there, anything he needed, or if he needed to turn around and get up fast. Because when you dive and you hold your breath and you go down a great depth, even 10 feet, you're starting to tax the lung. The lung gets smaller and smaller until it becomes, I think the scientific definition is given to me by Dr. Schaefer from the submarine lab was something like a walnut. That's the size of your lung. Now, the idea about that is okay, but don't stay there. You've got to turn around and come back up, and as you do, you have to go like just a little brief, which starts it again. And you're not breathing, but you've started your lung re-expanding, if you will, as you surface. And that's when you can get the bends if you do it too fast. You're not supposed to come up that line too fast because it results in bends. So the whole crew was practicing. Accompanying Croft, how far would he go, make sure they didn't have the bends, and they were stationed at different depths on that line. In fact, they had several lines. They were joking. They'd say, "Well, put me on one." I said, "No, I'm not in the Navy, and you can't do that. Not yet." But they surprised me. Croft would come up from his dive, and they said, "Well, that's it for today. We went deeper than yesterday," and they'd throw me over the side, and I was wallowing around in the water. And as I explained to Joni and some of the folks here, I wasn't a really good swimmer, but I learned very quickly to make sure because I had to come around the side of the boat. They thought that was outstanding. My effort, of course, I got a round of applause. All the time that Croft was training to break this record, you got things like Skin Diver magazine, which published the scientific end of it, because the Navy took not a competition of breath hold diving depths into consideration. They thought that was very good, applaud, applaud. But they were interested in the scientific statement which says, how deep can man really go? And that's what Croft was about to prove because of his phenomenal physiognomy. But the main thing to think of is that it'll change the diving tables of the world. That's very important. And we were only down there for about a week or so, or 2 weeks at the most, at the outside. And going for the record meant that we had to make every point count. As you will see in the flick that we're going to show you of the documentary of the story of his championship dive, we had to cope with all kinds of things that consist of Mother Nature's capricious approach. One of them was a severe storm, which held us off for a day and stalled everything, and put the crimp in everybody's preparations, and we had to kind of start all over again. We were running out of time. So it all depends on what it does, the storm that is, to the ocean itself. And that's when you run into some problems. You got to wait for the seas to calm down again, because you've got human folks in there, and they bob around a lot because the sea can handle anything. From the biggest boats on down, it's nothing, as you know. So that's where it all turned to. The reason we gave it the title 33 Fathoms, I kept thinking of, what are you going to call this if we have a successful movie? And 33 Fathoms stands for 200 feet plus. And the Navy people said, good thinking. I said, well, you're used to it. And so that's the way it stayed. Now, what resulted from all of this was quite interesting. It became, or made me, a one-book author. And I'm not bragging about it. I'm very happy, because the people who liked it when they saw it, and we, believe me, auditioned and peddled this a lot when it was done. I brought it back to New York City, and Warner Brothers 7 Arts at the time bought it out of Hollywood. And we were thrilled, because we had a premiere in Florida, a premiere here in Hartford, because Croft was in Connecticut at the Navy base. And so we had a wonderful time, because, as you know by now what I'm saying to you, the last day we reached 200 plus, 212 feet plus. And let me just tell you what we did there. When we first got down to Florida, we had a couple of things that we wanted to put on our jackets, like the logos. So we had, here it is, we had this little sketch made of a patch that we could have for our attempt at breaking the depths, which became 212.7. And there it is. Supposedly Croft. The guy wasn't bad. I couldn't do better. I have great stick drawings, but nobody ever seemed to have any idea they wanted to see them. But that was our patch, and we made it. So we took the whole story, and when we did it, I had, of course, alerted the newspapers and the media, and they were all over us. The final dive, the boats were in the waters around Fort Lauderdale, is where we went out of. And it was amazing how we had the Huntley-Brinkley report in those days on NBC. They grabbed all my film before I could stop them. And I was scared to death, because that was it. That's the original film. But they packaged it nicely and sent it back to me, and I was scared to death. But it made the nightly news. And so everybody was excited when we phoned Connecticut, and they said, gee, what did you do? We saw you on the news. I said, well, we broke the record. And so we went from there, 33 Fathoms plus, all over the world with Warner Brothers. We went on planes. You know how you tap in and want to see a movie on a plane? We were on the planes. We were down in Hawaii, and all over the world, actually, and the United States. So we had 2 premieres, as I said, Fort Lauderdale and Hartford. Ann Usello was the mayor in those days, and she came to our premiere and was, we date ourselves when we say this, was then the Strand Theater in Hartford, no longer there. We had some notable celebrities join us in the curiosity about Croft's deep dives, and you might know they would be aquatic types. One of the types that joined us down in Fort Lauderdale was the man who is spoken very highly of in those areas, because that's where he lived and that's what he did with his life. He was an Olympic swimmer and Tarzan of the Apes. And I'm talking about Johnny Weissmuller, who was still alive at that time and very much enthralled by Croft's efforts. And he hung out with us and went out on the diving boat. This was the second dive. And he had heard of us the first time around when we made the movie, and we premiered it, as I mentioned earlier, in Hartford at the Strand Theater with Mayor Ann Usello. We invited him to come up and be a guest. Of course, it would make a wonderful propaganda piece, so to speak. But instead of that, he had other engagements, but he was very kind. And this is what we read at the Strand Theater the night of the reception and the premiere in Hartford. A note from Johnny Weissmuller. Dear Bob, I wish I could be with you and the 33 Fathoms Plus gang tonight as you view the magnificent film of Bob Croft's exploit in going deeper without diving apparatus than any man before. I enjoyed working with all of you in Fort Lauderdale, and I'm looking forward to seeing you when you come back for another descent into the depths next August. All my best, Johnny Weissmiller. And the P.S. was cute. He says, if you can do it, give a jungle victory yell for me. Now, the other celebrity was a big band vocalist, and some of you recall Johnny Desmond. Johnny Desmond was with the Overseas Glenn Miller Band for a long, long time, and whether he continued extensively after that, when they came home following the tragedy of losing Glenn Miller during the war, I don't know. But we did get to talk to Johnny Desmond aside when his interest came to Bob Croft. And in New York City is where we were doing some post-production work. And he said, gee, I want to talk to you guys. And we went to his restaurant over on 57th Street at that time. And he talked to Bob about free breath hold diving from his viewpoint. He was an average diver. But he said, do you know of the Italian aeropaco, what they call packing air? In other words, an extension of exceptional lung restoration and storage of the breath, so that when you go on a dive like that, you have what is known as aeropaco, or a sort of a reserve in case you need, as I mentioned before. This could be very, very dangerous if you can't get that lung pumped again when you're trying to come back up and survive your dive. But that's how he and Croft got to be good friends, and so we had celebrities interested in free breath hold diving. Not that they attempted the same thing that Bob did, because he was unusually equipped to do so. But it was a great deal of fun. Now this brought us to competition. After the excitement died down, so to speak, and everything went around that comes around, the science became more vital to the Navy than ever. They said, gee, if he can do that, let's pressure a little bit and carefully if he can go deeper. Meanwhile, Jacques Mayol, who was another free breath hold diver, now Stadigorius is out of it for some reason. He never got back in the swim, but Mayol said, well, I can go that deep, and he claimed on his own with some of his mates that he made it. And it became a challenge. You know how the newspaper will pick up a thing like that, and Croft says, sure, if you want to compete, let's do that. And that's what happened. The two men started to reach out for competition on who could dive the deepest in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, it turned out that we made the Guinness Book of Records with the first dive, and they kept all these sources. Come on, keep going, you know. And that's dangerous. You can't play around like that, and I was very, very strong on that subject. I didn't want to be responsible for it. Tell you a small joke, and all you service guys out there will laugh with me. The Navy gave him permission, Croft, to go on every one of these dives in Florida. He would borrow a piece of his leave time, as you know. And they said, well, his contribution to science is important, but our biggest problem is that anything happens to him. So they issued the following warrant verbally to Bob Croft. They said, anything happens to you while you're out there diving, and you shouldn't come back to us because of what you've done to yourself, we will court-martial you. And everybody said, what? But that's the way the Navy felt. That's, you know, it's de facto. You guys have been through it, so you know what I'm saying. But it did result in competition diving between these two men, Jacques Mayol and Bob Croft. And we're going back now to July of '66 with the Mayol entry, which was 200, he claimed 215, which bested Bob's 212.7 the previous February. And then Mayol came back again with 231 feet on January 14th, 1968. And meanwhile, the United States Navy is saying, well, Bob, you've got to give us 2 or 3 days when you're down here because we're into science. And this is a picture of how they rigged poor Bob when they were testing his lungs when he was doing these record dives, or just the dives in the depths that they were interested in. And you know what the result of this was that the Navy was doing? proving that man could dive deeper than he ever thought before. And it also proved that they would change the diving tables of the world. You divers out there will know what I'm talking about. Now, Jacques Mayol's 231 stood until August 12th of 1968, when Croft went for 240 feet as the new record. And that was endorsed, by the way, by a timekeeper from the United States Navy who brought a device in from London. So we were supervised by overseas and authorities here at home in the United States to make sure that these were all authenticated depths. The Navy, of course, was being objective in terms of the doctors that were on the line with the Navy doctors from Miami University. And that was the team that lined up the scientific end of this thing. And as far as we were concerned, we had made a movie. But we got called back by NBC, and they did a piece on his new dive, the 240-foot dive, on a network documentary. And as a result, Croft made personal appearances at fishing shows, all kinds of carnivals and appearances here, there, and the other place. And he said, "Why can't we get more appearances down in Florida?" I said, "And I'll tell you why, Bob, because all the times when we take time out for a break at night and discuss what had happened the previous day and go out for just a little fun, more people were hunting buried treasure in the seas off Florida than any place I'd ever heard of in my life. I had a man come up to me one night, took a coin, and flipped it in front of me. He said, "You know what that is?" He said, "That's from a Spanish wreck of 3 centuries ago." I said, "Really?" I said, "Where'd you get it?" He said, "It's shallow. It sank in the shallows, right off Fort Lauderdale. I can take you right to it." He said, "There's a fortune down there." He said, "But I need a backer." I said, "Don't look at me. We barely came up with a backer, and fortunately we have a scientific end of this business, or else we wouldn't be here at all." But anyway, that went on all over the place. And as you know, a couple of discoveries were made through the old Spanish galleons that had been sunk many, many years ago, centuries ago. And one guy came up with a galleon down there, and I forget the circumstances and the people, but they were able to put that galleon on display, and they made $1 million. They made $1 million just by what they brought up. But you know, whenever you bring something up from the bottom of the sea, certain claims are made by the feds. It's mandatory. It's what we do here. And so that's why we didn't get into buried treasure. And Bob said, "I don't feel I want to do that." He said, "Besides, if I come up, they'll take it away from me anyway." And they were probably quite right. So anyway, 33 Fathoms did prompt the competition and the scientific end results, and in a pretty good movie, which I now want you to sit back and enjoy, called 33 Fathoms Plus, when Bob Croft broke the record for the United States of America. Let's watch.
Older than man is able to trace is his desire to walk, dive, or just descend beneath the sea. There are many recorded moments of attempts to conquer the environment of water. It could well be, as many historians infer, that man occasionally reaches back what may have been his origin. It is the naked or free breath hold diver, however, that real challenge, for it is this method that presents the greatest risk. In the modern idiom, man continues his search beneath the sea. The United States Navy supplies many of the men and the answers. These blue jackets are part of a growing team, willing to make any sacrifice which could lead to a breakthrough for man and his environment. Nowhere does the meaning of man in the sea inspire more loyalty and pride than here in Groton, Connecticut, home of submariners and submarine instructors for the entire Navy. The possibilities of tomorrow are reflected in the mirror of today. This tower, houses the submarine escape training tank, a place where men learn how to survive. In their everyday jobs as sailors aboard submarines, there may be a crucial time when they will have to depend upon their training to survive. You are watching examples of escape from the 50-foot level of the 118-foot tank. Here, Robert A. Croft and his team began their preparations for the free breath hold dive for the world's record. Two retired Navy divers, Ernie Colburn and Tony Catugno, and two active divers on duty with the Navy, Jim Schwartz and John Williams, were chosen to become Croft's team for the expedition off Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Each day, following strict Navy diving procedure, they prepared in every way possible. Nothing, however, is the same as salt water. Many questions remain to be answered in the Atlantic Ocean. By now, the world was slowly learning about Project 33 Fathoms Plus. When the team began arriving in Fort Lauderdale in January, the first news stories had begun to tell of the effort that was to be made by this small band of Navy divers to break the 54-year-old world depth record. This was an unusual expedition, and it had a few gory possibilities. No man had gone over 200 feet in a naked dive successfully in recent years. A Frenchman and an Italian were the deepest free divers at this point. Dr. Jim Doherty tested the bird resuscitator as a group of curious onlookers gathered on the Marina wharf. The specially designed handbrake was tested. And Bill Fay, skipper of the Navy diver, and Frenchie Colburn gave the signal to get underway. By Friday, February 3rd, Croft and the support tug were ready for the first dives. The trial and error at sea. A host of boats, plus a seagoing tug loaded with press, radio, and television reporters, followed the diving craft out of the harbor. A submarine, based in Connecticut, the likes of which had been a former home to most of the crew. Croft's way of life for 12 years.
Right in between the two boats. Okay, too high enough.
The tension began to increase aboard ship as Jim Schwartz adjusted his Mae West life jacket. Jim was the safety and escort diver. His mission was to dive with Croft and monitor his every move. Safety was the first consideration of all hands. One last check on the handbrake was made. Constantly in the mind of the team was the thoracic squeeze, which crushes an ordinary man's chest cavity at 90 to 120 feet.
Other divers, down. Doherty, down. Down. Fourth, fifth, and down.
3 descending lines were used to render support to Croft and the other. Everybody was standing by. The team was ready. So was Croft. Now he tried a few test dives for size. He and the salt water were compatible.
Leaving surface.
Now he went for a run. Hand over hand, down, 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 until 134 feet had been attained. Then the signal for ascent. Hand over hand to the surface. Each line was held taut 250 feet deep by a 100-pound lead weight. 3 lines to destiny. Summary for the first day. Object 100 feet with the weighted handbrake. On the third and last run of the day, 121 feet were recorded. Croft had used his face mask on the initial run only to test his eardrums and sinuses, to assure his ability to withstand the rapid increase of pressure during descent with the weight in hand. Saturday was another fine day, with all hands enjoying their work in preparation for the record run. The results were encouraging again. 25 increment runs, among them a dive of 170 feet for the deepest run in the ocean to that date. Sunday was pretty much the same, with the possibility of an instant success at almost any dive. Croft made the deepest run of any American to that time when he dove to 185 feet in the Gulf Stream off Fort Lauderdale. This was an indication of Croft's capability, and it might have been deeper, for the record, if Bob had been able to determine during the dive that all conditions were favorable according to the plans. Monday looked like the day to try for the record. The weather began to show an ugly side. Seas were running higher.
Hey, would it help if somebody was to latch on the frame of this thing and pull it around? The hell with the sun? I can't do it. It's close. I can ventilate it underwater. Hey, Bob, you raise the speed up, you get more air than you get. Those will save the swell problem. All right? You want to try that?
In spite of extreme conditions, Croft went for the record around 10 a.m. on the 6th, but he was to be denied because of a malfunction of the handbrake. Timing and human error decimated the team's efforts. 130 feet was the deepest run. The cover divers were on station too long. Too much decompression time for scuba support divers.
I think I see something. Croft on view. Croft the surface. Okay, Bob. Time. 93 seconds. 93 seconds. He must have gone 100. Yeah.
The weather finally turned sour. The divers worked laboriously to bring the handbrake to the surface. Tuesday was scrubbed, and the entire team was beached. On Ash Wednesday, the 8th day of February 1967, the weather broke miraculously after an all-night tropical rain had washed the air and the sea clean and calm.
We're going to take a 30-foot stop for 1 minute, a 20-foot stop for 5 minutes, and a 10-foot stop for 13 minutes. Remembering that there's 1 minute between stops, and that means even from the 10-foot stop to surface. Schwartz has also got to take decompression.
Water, this is Coast Guard Radio Miami. You're loud and clear, Captain, over.
The last man out of the water will be myself. I'll overstay my decompression to follow Schwartz out.
Now everyone was suddenly aware that the team had to get on station while the weather was calm. Croft was elated, and they all realized that it was now or never.
Schwartz
away.
One of our deep men, John Williams, racing against time to get on station at 200 feet. Croft plunged into the familiar waters, down about 20 feet. The temperature was good, and the wind and waves were fairly calm. Bill Fay again threw a line to the auxiliary boat to hold the stern of his craft, Navy diver, steady to the lee. Croft now began hyperventilating. He then gave the nod to his cover divers to leave the surface. Each man knew by prearrangement what his cover depth would be. Once again, 2 minutes was required for the deepest man to position himself. 1 minute later, Croft began to inhale his final lungful of air. He gave a final signal of readiness to his escort diver. Topping off his immense lungs, all hands knew he was ready to leave the surface. This was the 25th dive, but the first and only dive for the record. Jim Doherty started to time the run. The handbrake with 59 pounds attached pulled Croft deep at better than 2 feet per second. The safety divers were stationed at 50-foot intervals. Each man would tap Croft lightly as he passed his position. 100. Then the fourth and last tap from Eric Rust, 200 feet. Now Croft was on his own. He would have to judge how far past the 200-foot mark he could safely go. The clip was on his cuff, ready to be affixed at the point over 200 feet that would establish the new world record. He swung around to an upright position, placed the clip on the line, just above the handbrake, then started the long 21-story climb to the surface. Croft emerged just ahead of his escort diver. Then the word was out. Unofficially, he had dived beyond 200 feet. A wave of excitement began to seize the witnesses aboard the standby craft. Now the ship-to-shore radios crackled the news. The record was USA for the first time in history. Bob Croft would replace the gallant Stotty Gorius after 54 years as the deepest human free breath hold diver. A clean sweep. The record stood at 212 feet 7 inches. He had held his breath for 2 minutes and 6 seconds.
Whiskey Echo 6000, this is Coast Guard Radio Miami. Radio Miami, you're loud and clear, Captain, over.
Okay, I'll see you.
These men who had gambled their lives against time and nature to prove man's ability in the sea, mindful that only the sea can make the final decision. There can only be a compromise between man and the sea, for it is she who decides their fates anytime they sail or swim her vastness.
Let me tell you a funny thing that happened to me. And I'd been called in by Discovery Channel to narrate this particular dictator story called Fidel. They were in a huff. Something had happened in terms of their timetable and the calendar, and it had to be released at a certain point. But they had to go all over the production all over again, not the editing of the main story, but the soundtrack and whatever supported that, and music and support and whatever. But they called me in and they said, we've got to do this fast, we've got to do it today, and there's no waiting and no delay. We'll always stop when it comes to the Spanish towns, make sure we've got the right pronunciation and so on. Well, that's what you live under when you're a narrator and you work that kind of a situation as your occupation, as I do. And I was thrilled, and I thought, this is exciting, and we'll do it. It was a long afternoon, and I didn't think it was going as well as it should. You know, you always have second guessing when you're doing something. If you're a musician, you say, oh, I didn't play that part too well. Or if you're another performer, I didn't dance that well, or I didn't sing. And the narrator says, gee, I don't think that sounded as good as some of the other things I've done. You're your own worst critic. Well, what happened to me was we got through in all of the exercises I've told you about the pronunciation in the afternoon. And my young lady producer said to me, she says, good. Now she says, it's in the can and that's it. And I said, well, gee, you know, I felt as though things didn't go as well as I could have done better for you. And she's, no, she says, everything was fine. Don't worry about it. She said, everything's cool. I said, well, sometime if I ever get a chance, I'd like to see the script in advance. And she said, oh, sure, but she says, this was strictly an emergency. I said, okay. Well, I didn't think about it anymore for about 3 weeks. I got another call, as you do. Your agent calls you, and she called me to do a job in the same studio. And I had been working for Discovery Channel all along with other documentations and dramas. And I got called in for this particular day to do another job. And the engineer says, how you doing? I said, fine. He says, congratulations on your Emmy. I said, yeah. I said, now, seriously, I said, tell me, did they roll my name at the beginning of it? You know, you want the recognition. He says, don't worry about your name. It's the first one that rolls in the show. He said, but seriously, congratulations on your Emmy. I said, all right. I said, what's the joke all about? He said, no kidding. He said, the whole production went so well when the award time came around from the greater Washington area, the whole show, Fidel Castro and the dictators, Emmys. He says, your show got an Emmy, and you're right in there. Well, naturally, that was a great start for me to work that day. I felt quite buoyant as a result of it. And sure enough, I called up, and I went to the Motion Picture Academy people, and I said, is this true? And they said, oh, absolutely. I said, oh, by the way, what's your address? And I gave them my address. We were living in Maryland at the time because I was working for the Voice of America, as I did for several years, and that was my home, our home. So I walked to the post office about a week after this conversation I told you about, and I opened up the box, and out comes this roll, and I opened it up, and this is without a lie. And I told this to Joni, too, and she must remember this. I couldn't help it. You know, grown guys do cry. I opened it up, and there it was. It said, Motion Picture Academy and Television Awards in Greater Washington honor Bob Ellsworth. Whoa, I cried because I was very proud. I mean, you know, Emmys are, you know, they don't come off the shelf at you. And it was just wonderful to have it. And I felt good about it because I thought, well, we're kind of doing something pro-American here. And it was, you know, Stars and Stripes forever. And we're just talking about the fall of communism. So it felt good all around. I'd like to share that story with you, and I hope you understand my pride. I wanted to make a documentary because there was a great market for the documentary. And I thought something unusual. And I had heard about Sable Island through a friend. That's how you get into trouble, when you hear about things through a friend in this world. But it sounded fascinating because of the tremendous number of wrecks. And the irony of it is, there was a ship that was wrecked off Sable Island, a merchant ship, called the SS Manhasset. And that's kind of the area I come from on Long Island, Manhasset. We lived in Plandome, adjacent to Manhasset. So a lot of things fascinated me about the island. And I'll tell you, there was a wonderful story with great text and pictures in National Geographic magazine at the time. And that fascinated me. The stories of how the certain type of bird out of Massachusetts, a sparrow, migrated to Sable Island every winter. And the seals, and just everything generally. And the little flowers that grow on Sable Island, tiny roses. And then there was the beautiful cake that was made by the skipper of the island, Mr. Bell, and his wife. And she made a cake and invited me over one night for dinner, from these little berries that grew around this lake, inland lake. In the middle of this little island is an inland lake. And guess what? Not salt water, but fresh water. And I saw a baby seal with the most beautiful eyes take one look at me, and it ran, I don't blame it, and it ducked into the fresh water. And I can't tell you how deep. But that water was the source of refreshment for the horses that lived on the island. They knew where the fresh water was. But it was surrounded in the most beautiful way on the tips. You could see the ocean coming in from 3 different directions. So there was nothing but photography on that island, as you can well imagine. Well, I was an adopted kid, as I've told you, And these folks were old enough to be my grandparents that adopted me. But my mother was determined. She wanted to finish off her life, and I respect her for that. And my biological mother was good to me. I was lucky to have, she wanted to make sure that I got adopted into a nice home. And in New York City, you could wind up in the orphan asylum, and that's not too cool. And I was getting on. I was getting on. I was almost 4 when I got a home. But it was a fortunate thing for me when you think about it. I mean, where else could I have, gotten the opportunity? But it was only from 4 to 15, because 15 I went to high school. I loved it. I came out of all the private efforts that were being made, and so on. I had a good time in high school. And participating in things. I was a joiner. Right away I joined. Would you want to believe, as a kid who came out of no place, I was president of my homeroom for 3 years? The kids elected me every year. I was president, and they put me on the ticket to run for president in the school. And I hadn't known those kids, and I lost by a small margin. I was amazed. But you know what they put me in charge of, the school? They put me in charge of the Friday afternoon special events, music. And they'd wheeled out 2 grand pianos. Ronald Dye, who was my drawing teacher, mechanical drawing teacher, used to play with bands on the boats. And he and I had played big band stuff, 2 pianos. We were the poor man's Ferranti and Teicher. He could ad-lib anything I'd ad-lib, and I was ad-libbing this stuff off reading. I wasn't this good with the ear. Yeah, my ear was all right. But I would make arrangements off music, because that's how wound I was into things. The kids, they would pack the auditorium on those Fridays. And I looked back on the paper, and the school put me in charge of it. But I was a ne'er-do-well. My marks were not where they should be. They were just barely qualifying for college, according to New York State Regents. So therefore, that didn't push me into oblivion. But my teacher came to me one day, Wild Bill Merrill, and he said to me, he says, Ellsworth, he says, I'll tell you one thing. He says, you're going to go to Colgate. That was his alma mater. And he says, you're going to Colgate. I said, why should I go there? He says, because they can handle you. That's where you're going. And of course, interrupting that, I enlisted in the Army and went off to war. But I had signed up for Colgate, and when I came back, I went right back to Colgate.